welcome to our live stream. I'm here today with our prof teaching artist, Alex Rowe, and Lauryn Welch. Today, we are doing a crit clash on the comics artist, Robert Crumb. And if you would like to grow as an artist and you can't afford an art class, we've got everything you need here at Art Prof, critiques and tutorials. Here's how crit clash works. We assign a point of view to each of us. So for example, today, Alex is going to argue for Robert Crumb's work. Lauryn is going to be arguing against Robert Crumb's work. And what Alex and Lauryn say may not actually be what they believe in real life about Robert Crumb. What we do is we do the stream, and then after the stream, we meet up in the Art Prof Discord, where Alex and Lauryn will reveal their true feelings about Robert Crumb. All right, to get us started with this crit clash, we do want you to know that we do have a mature content warning, so please be aware of that. If you feel that that's something you don't want to watch, I would go watch something else, because we are going to be talking about some topics that are mature. Let me give you guys some basics about Robert Crumb and who he is. And let us know in the chat, do you guys know who Robert Crumb is? Are you just finding out about him right now? And Lauryn, actually, when did you first find out about Robert Crumb as an artist?
Well, my dad, he was born in 1948, and he was of that counterculture circle. And the zine movement was, I'm going to call it analogous or associated with the mail art movement, MAIL, like postage movement. So between the counterculture and the counter art movement, Robert Crumb was a big name. I learned more about his work when I was at RISD taking some printmaking and illustration courses during winter session. But that is my extent, is having his work associated or known through references from my father and studying him a little bit in my printmaking illustration courses.
And so you guys can see from a lot of these slides, there really is almost nothing that Robert Crumb didn't touch. I mean, his work deals with religion, in which case here, the book of Genesis, which he illustrated. He has a lot of racist imagery, misogynistic imagery, a lot of it's political and social. And he's married to Aileen Kominsky-crumb, and she is actually a cartoonist. And so they are very much two creative people working together. And so you can see here is one of her cartoons as well. And so as you can imagine, he's a complicated artist. People have very strong feelings about him. And actually, we found that there's a lot of correlations between Robert Crumb and this previous crit clash that we did about Kim Jung-gi, because there was a lot of information about the sexual content and the misogynistic imagery. And so this is such a different artist, but I think a lot of similar themes that we're going to be digging into. So we would love to hear what you guys think. Alex, when was the first time you encountered Robert Crumb's work?
If I really look back on it, it was probably a bumper sticker of Mr. Normal on the back of a Subaru in Colorado. So that was my first interaction. And then it was like Lauryn diving in with art school and learning in a more academic setting his impact on the comics world. And very, let's say ironically enough, it was after that and diving and researching into him more that I discovered all of the very problematic images in his work. So it's very...
And he's somebody who has been very active for a long time. I mean, he was pretty much at his prime when he was in the 60s. But the thing is, I mean, the image actually we're looking at now was just made a couple years ago. So he's not somebody who ever really stopped producing. He's really an incredibly productive artist when you think about the amount of work that he's created throughout his career. Lauryn, get us started. Your first argument against Robert Crumb.
Well, we already kind of talked about it a little bit. He is an extremely prolific artist and an extremely well-known artist, but the quality of images that he is putting out there into the world are somewhat questionable, given that he has so much power in the art world. The images, particularly of women and of Black people and of Black women, are extremely problematic. And he has made some apologies about this in recent years, saying he is better than this, he's a nice guy, this was during a certain time, but I think we really need to deep dive into that, examine that a bit more, because that, since he was so widely populated, shared in the world, that does create a certain amount of people following that set of imagery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even, I have to say, even as being pro Crum for this video, that is something like that I cannot argue or disagree with. And his apology is very much not enough, in my view. It essentially concludes with, oh, but it was all ironic, which is not the right response. I think that in the course of his work, some of it was very powerful and important in a period of time in history, not just in art, but in culture, of sexual liberation, sexual freedom. And some of his work affected that. But I am not mincing words in saying that the vast majority of his work did more harm than good and is far more problematic than it was helpful in any way. And I think that he is using in his apology, he cited his libido, and he said, I don't really draw anymore because I'm 75 now. And I just, in my head, there are too many artists that I can think of who illustrate and draw their sexuality in a way that is not offensive and illegal and certainly immoral.
Yeah, Alex, that is good that you bring that up. And I actually want to also bring up Neil's comment here, which is extremely helpful. So, Neil says, I'm going to throw in Eloise's argument in the Jung-Gi crit clash and say that he's a white straight male and this stuff is subconscious and he's just exploring it. Art should be free. So that was a common thing in that crit clash. And we can talk about, hey, you're growing up in this certain framework, this white-oriented framework, white heterosexual-oriented framework to begin with. How can he not do those things? So I think it is important to look at maybe now and the apology that he gave now that you were just talking about. And his solution to that was he said he was not going to draw women anymore. And I think that if we're going to look at his artwork and then look at his response to the questions about his artwork, and that being his solution or his response, I don't know if that's the right response.
Yeah, I think...
Go ahead.
No, you finish.
I just... I just feel like, okay, so you go from portraying women in this very provocative, sexual, kind of demeaning way, in a way you could call as ironic, but people don't necessarily read that irony. And then you go from not talking about them at all because you're 75 and your libido doesn't exist anymore. That still puts it in this framework of women are only good for their sexual qualities, which I feel like I would hope that we're beyond that at this point, that you could see a woman or portray a woman as more than their body type and what you desire in a body. And I think that speaks to this idea of, he was talking about empowering women because they've got strong muscular bodies, still really rooted in this attractiveness of the body.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at this comment first. Hans J. says, just because he's a straight white dude with racist imagery in his subconscious doesn't mean he should make tons of money off of it. Well, Alex, what's the argument for why you would be justified to have imagery that we can all collectively agree, racism, misogyny, not good things, but is there a place for that in art history?
In art history, I'm trying to think of the historical word for a sketchbook. Because, yeah, there's the thing with R. Crum, and Lauren, you were talking a lot about this too, that his apology, I think it's very telling that he found it easier to just stop drawing women than it was for him to address these issues within himself. And like, we've been talking kind of out of the gate with both of us, Con, but yeah, I am approaching it from a pro Crum standpoint because I think his work and elements of his comic work does have value, but this is something where it's just like kind of straight out of the gate. It's like, no, it must be addressed because unfortunately it's such a big bulk of his work.
Yeah.
Well, so Alex, how do you justify that? I mean, is it just, oh, we just appreciate the style of his drawing and we just look at the content separately? Can you make a pro argument for why we should have images like this out there? Because these are not pretty images. These are not images that I think are here to make anybody happy or to show anything admirable about the human race. If anything, it's the opposite of that. So are you only able to argue for the stylistic look, or can you make any argument for this type of content?
It's funny. I thought about that a lot, like leading up to this stream, because I was thinking of the academic setting in which I learned Crum, and then in the world and growing up and in interacting with that question. And I think for Crum, what I'm learning from it is you cannot hide the harm that was done. You cannot hide the problems within the work. You cannot. And just like you can't hide that, you also can't hide the lessons that are in some of the craft he creates. His work, especially in the field of comics, was undeniably groundbreaking. And I think that it's a disservice to show that without showing how awful some of his work was. Like in my case, I learned about him in an academic setting where it was only positive things. And I think it's much better to paint a picture of an accurate life rather than a strictly academic one where you only talk about the good things.
Well, let's pivot the conversation towards the visuals, because you just said, Alex, that in the terms of the comics world, he was groundbreaking. And I think a lot of people do see his work that way. So, Lauren, what is your take on his contribution to the comics world? Do you feel that he was groundbreaking as well?
I do, actually. I do think that he was groundbreaking. I do think that this work is still immensely influential on comic artists to this day. I mean, I remember being in RISD and one of my peers who now does illustrations for the New York Times was extremely into his work and the style of it and the way that he does figures, that stylization. So I'm not going to argue that, but he is, even though he goes across a really wide range of subject matter. I mean, he's doing the religious stuff, he's doing the really sexual stuff, he's all over the place, right? But he really does stick to a certain type of figuration, stylization within the figure, and a certain type of layout in terms of paneling. And so you can say they stretched himself maybe content-wise or at least stream of thought-wise, but maybe not so much in terms of what he is able to do with the figure. Like, you see these women that he's drawing, and he generally accentuates the same thing all the time. It's really the butts and the breasts and the thighs. And he's really good at that particular thing and the line work on that thing and the shading and all of that. And I don't really see much variation within those figures, is what I'm saying. I don't know. Alex, do you have another take?
Yeah, I think that as far as the most groundbreaking work he's done in comics, and where I think he's most often referenced and cited, is his skill in organizing the panels. And for me, it's how he can have a whole page that is just two heads talking with a lot of dialogue, which is like a cartoonist's nightmare. Like, how do you make that visually exciting? And he does it. And it's really funny, like, as far as the difference in how he draws men and sexualized women. This is a really good panel to look at, because it's almost like when he's drawing hypersexualized women, he handles that drawing with such a strange handle on the pen, which is an intentionally creepy thing to say in how he handles it. But then you look at drawings like this, and this is the element of how wild and free and gross but beautiful he can make his world and environment. Like, everything's grungy. Like, there's not a spot on the sidewalk that doesn't have a cigarette butt or a stick of gum on it. And it's that kind of sublime, harsh reality of it that is my personal favorite part of his work.
Do you feel, Alex, that it's about him fluctuating between beauty and grotesqueness, that you're not really sure which one it is? And maybe that's why it's so fascinating as work, because there is a lot of work that you just say, oh, that's blatantly horrible. And there's other work you say, oh, that's blatantly beautiful. But he fluctuates in a way that I think for a lot of people is somewhat seductive in an odd way. It's sort of like a car crash. Like you can't help yourself but look, even though you're sort of horrified at the same time. So, yeah. Lauren, can we dig a little bit more into why you think his style is almost that one-trick pony situation?
Yeah, I think that he does really good at this particular type of thing. This beautiful to the point of ugly, or ugly to the point of beautiful kind of thing. So bad it's good, which I do find that weird liminal space very interesting. As a painter, that's a huge thing. Beauty's not in right now. So there is this certain thing that is appealing about it, because it's so weird how you are just mesmerized by it. But at the same time, I'm thinking of artists, comic artists or comic writers that are his somewhat contemporaries that do a same thing, but on a more, I'm going to say, complex scale or more interesting scale. Particularly, I'm thinking of, I believe it's Alan Moore, who also writes very grotesque and cynical and political kinds of stories for comics. He did From Hell, Watchmen, some other things, and is able to lay that out in a way that is so much more interesting visually in terms of shots and things, but also as far as like the storyline goes. I feel like Crumb's very much like the type of person that you read these things and you get a kick out of it, as in this kind of one-liner comedian kind of way, but you don't go further than that in a way. Like it's really good because of the shock value of it and not necessarily because of the story value of it. So I'm just looking at the people around him and what they're doing versus what he was doing.
We have some comments here. Hans J is saying, absolutely. I love saying, is it hideous? Yes. Is it beautiful? Yes. And also James Arca is saying, totally grotesque subject matter and everything too. And another comment from Seven Angelic Enigma. There's something appealing about being irreverent in counterculture, but at a point we have to look at it and see what is really being said. Well, what do you think, Alex? Is Lauren right about this style thing? Because we're looking at one here that's got some pretty wacky panels.
Yeah, and this is something where there's just no other way to talk about it. This was in a period of his time as a cartoonist where it was both a breakthrough for him, but also extremely self-destructive, where he encountered the drug culture of the 60s and 70s. And he even remarks in interviews that it destroyed 2 years of his life. Like, it ended a relationship. He was like destitute, homeless, and his experiences from that still led him, I think, to make some really interesting works like this that are kind of hit that weirdness that he always wants to portray. And I think that's the stuff, when I see it, I get almost frustrated at his past work, where I'm like, why didn't you do more like that? Like, why is your portfolio not full of that kind of work? This, yeah, like the self-loathing comics is such a wonderful example, and his autobiographical pieces are very perfect because they're so funny in a very self-deprecating way. Like there's one in particular where he's walking through the streets at night as a young adult and is talking about the angst inside and how like, no, I'm right, the whole world is wrong. And it's like, yeah, that is teenage angst. Yeah, it's the freedom and how weird he can get with his comics that I think is the breakthrough with him and what makes him unique.
Let's also talk a little bit about humor, because I think a lot of people do associate comics with humor to one degree or another. And I think some people might say, oh my God, this stuff is hilarious. It makes me laugh. It's so weird. It's so wacky. And other people might look at it and say, you know what, this isn't funny when you're talking about women's bodies and racism. And so what about the humor aspect, Lauryn? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I do want to mention that I did see this, I guess you would call it a retrospective show of his at David's Werner, which is a very fancy gallery and also a very strange place to see these underground comics being shown. That's a whole critique unto itself. Why are these very counterculture objects being shown in the epitome of art accepted culture? I mean, we're at a different point now. But anyways, when I was looking at these comics and I was reading them, you know, my partner is very into these images, these comics. And so I was like, oh, I'm so excited to look at more of these. And I didn't really relate to them that much. And I am sure that's a lot because of the jokes that were being talked about in them. They're very offensive oftentimes. They're done in this ironic kind of way a lot of times. Like the redeeming quality, I think, to our Crum is that he's very self-effacing and he is self-critical, but it's written in this, I'm going to call it an unfiltered, populist kind of way that appeals to a certain kind of person that feels like they don't really fit into a high society. They're really meant to be lowbrow, the jokes. And that, while it seems to be for a wide audience, really might be actually for a sort of smaller audience than one would think, because it's alienating to a lot of groups of people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, and it's funny that we're looking at the slides now of Mr. Natural, because like I said, he was my first viewing of our Crum. And it's so funny. Like, imagine all the viewers, if your first glimpse of him was this comic, you'd have the same thought I did. It's like, man, why do people think he's offensive? And then, oh no. But yeah, I think that these are the ones that are like that kind of universal, dark, almost philosophical humor that can be very, very funny and in a very clever way. And by the way, these are the ones that I'm talking about. This is such a good example of, you've got just a bunch of dialogue, and this one, doing the dishes, is perfect. Like, of the visual storytelling and how he's guiding the eye through with the shapes. And this character is a phenomenal kind of critiquing lens into our culture and how we handle things and how we view things. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but in a very darkly funny way.
So you think his work is successful as a humorous comic?
I think it's kind of like what I said earlier in the stream with the more psychedelic work he did. Like, why didn't you do more work like that? I look at comics like that and say, God, why didn't you do more like that? Because I think Lauryn is very right that a lot of his humor does limit itself to a very small group of people, when ironically enough, his goal was to reach the common feelings in all people. and
You know you're arguing for him, right, Alex? You
but
might want to try making some arguments for him.
It's funny. I think we both did a really good pro-con throughout this. I think we're both confused.
Oh, it's so hard because he is a complex person. You can't deny the fact that he has had this huge influence on comics and on the art world in general. That irreverence is seen in a lot of other different mediums besides comics, but it is really hard to talk about in 2020, and I feel you, Alex.
Well, let's talk about his character design, because we've had streams here about character design, and oftentimes they're in films and TV shows, and there's no end of characters here, if you think about it. And some of them are a little bit more exaggerated, some of them less. I mean, I have to say, when this book of Genesis came out, which was just a few years ago, I was like, whoa, Robert Crumb, I didn't know you could do stuff like this. And so I was really taken aback by this stylistically, and also the choice of subject matter. I was like, really? You want to illustrate the Bible? Like, it just seemed like such a strange choice. And so do we admire him for taking this risk? Or do we roll our eyes and say, oh, come on, dude, who are you kidding? After your history as a comics artist, how could you think you could take on something like the Bible? Alex, what's your take?
I'll be very pro for this one. Cue heavy metal guitar. I think this is the coolest thing he did. Especially because of his counterculture history. And it's funny because Clara, we go way back, and in school I was really into kind of biblical imagery, and a goal was illustrating elements of the Bible. And in talking about it, religiosity aside, it is a monumental task. It is massive. And kind of you got to do a hats off to anyone that can do even a book like Crum did with Genesis. And I think that this was that important seminal work that showcases all of his good qualities. The character design, the composition of the panels, the let's say a presence of eroticism without being problematic. And it's such a boring thing, but a big thing, his hand lettering, which is phenomenal. And I know any graphic designer would say that it's not boring, but it's impressive.
Well, so Lauren, what's your argument against him illustrating the book of Genesis?
Man, I feel like I need to know more about the context of him illustrating this book of Genesis. Did he do this on a commission from someone, or was this something he just decided to do because
just look at it at total face value, because I do think there is value in looking at an artwork and not having researched it for 3 years. I think something that a lot of people got on us in the comments in the Kim Jung-gi crit clash, people said, you guys didn't do your research, you didn't find out everything there was about him, you didn't see every piece. But I think there is value in just the immediate impression with no background at all. So looking at it from that point of view, what do you see? How can you argue against this?
Well, oh man. I would personally read something like this because I am a very visual person, and something as complex as the Bible is difficult for me to get into. So on that note, I want to say, yes, this is a real interesting turn, but given his bad boy nature, and also actually that thing that you were praising with the hand lettering, some of this is rather distracting. I think trying to read this versus looking at the pictures, just the pictures themselves, does not, it doesn't focus, or it doesn't center the biblical story very well. If I was going to read this, I would just look at all of the pictures and not read that at all, because that writing is very difficult to read compared to what's happening in that paneling there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's good.
I think that, 9 times out of 10 in his comics, he's really good at choosing when to include words and when not to, and doing it so smartly. Is that a word?
Yeah. It is now. I guess that you've used it. We have a question here from James Arca. Yes. Does he make this Bible adaptation in the blasphemous way or a praising way? I mean, the thing about the Bible, I can't think of a single story that is more heated. You almost cannot illustrate the Bible without making a lot of people very angry. The same thing happened to Barry Mosher many years ago. Barry Mosher is a highly regarded, respected engraver and illustration. He couldn't pull it off. I mean, people were bothering him like crazy about it. So I just think it's an interesting take, given his history, that we're seeing him tackle stuff like this. But let's get back into his characters. Alex, do you think he's good at character design? Look at this one of just him and his wife.
Yeah, I think he's really good at character design and showing the little details in the interactions where he knows when at times to get really weird and funky, and he knows to get really absurd and crazy. But then at times, like and yes, what's for an artist, a self-portrait is always easier than a portrait of another, but his images of himself are so funny. They're so wonderful. This, like, the image of him reading with his wife, like, you can tell it's him, like his teeth and his beard. It's just such a perfect characterization. And in a way, one of the greatest character animators, Miyazaki, like in Spirited Away, people talk about how he mirrored the way his friends would eat food and reflected that in animation. And I get that impression from Art's characters, those drawing of little nuances in real life to incorporate.
Lauren, let's hear your argument against his character designs. Why do you think maybe they would not be working?
So in terms of character design, he has several different, I'm going to call them styles, and each style is used based on the level of seriousness that he wants a person to be cued into in the story. So here it's very frenetic. There's a lot of exaggeration in terms of the forms, the face, the eyes, the the legs, all that stuff. So, but then when he gets into this more serious side, where I'm going to call it more anatomically correct, it gets really stiff in a way that I feel like it doesn't have to. I'm specifically thinking of his Art and Beauty magazine, where he's taking these pictures of these women that people have sent to him and does these pictures based off of that. And they're just done in this way that is very, I'm going to say it's very detail oriented. It's very cared for, but it can't really escape, again, this hypersexualization that he can't seem to get beyond. He's really good at characterizing himself and putting him in these different forms, from really exaggerated, really crazy and comical to super serious. But women, he just can't find his scale is not as good, I'm just going to say.
We have a comment from BV. They're saying, this could be seen as kind of an ironic response. People who said his work was only successful because it was so irreverent, and he responds with this illustration with the subject as mortality. So it seems like there are different opinions, as in, oh, he's just saying what he thinks. It's stream of consciousness. And it seems like other people say, well, you know what? He was much smarter than that. He was putting that out there, but he maybe had an awareness that maybe some artists don't have. Because what you do see in Crumb's work, unlike Kim Jung-gi, is you do see commentary. You see him talking to the women. You see him talking to himself. And so, Alex, what about the, I suppose, crux of the commentary? Like, how does that play into this?
I think the problem with Crum and his journey is that he's a very talented artist and a very intelligent person who was trapped in a young person's body. And I think that even, like, yeah, it's hard. The hardest thing in the world is to learn and grow and to challenge yourself. And when you're a counterculture cartoonist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you're making a bunch of money doing, you can't help but let your career guide you at certain times. Or I guess when you do, it takes a lot of willpower. And I do think that, yeah, I think that sometimes he just kind of fell into the trap and the habit of not thinking about his work. But I think the pieces that he devotes so much thought and care to, which, yeah, ironically, his autobiographical stuff show a lot of care and thought and emphasis on thinking about his place in the world.
All right, guys, it is time for you to vote. Who won this crit clash? Alex was arguing for Robert Crumb. Lauryn was arguing against Robert Crumb. Who convinced you? Because I have to tell you guys, while you're putting in your votes into the chat, that I find myself very conflicted looking at his work, more so than when I look at Kim Jung-gi. This is real Clara speaking, by the way. I'm not part of the crit clash. I'm telling you guys what I actually think. And I think the thing is, I think what changes things for me is the writing, really, because Kim Jung-gi's work, it's not a comic. I acknowledge that for sure. But I mean, Crum, he's a guy that thinks. I don't think this is just him spilling whatever onto the sheet of paper. Granted, I have not read tons of Crumb's work, but from what I've seen, those words make a big difference. And it's hard for me just to say, oh, this is terrible. He makes women objects. And I feel that way for sure. But the thing is, he's a smart guy. That's the impression that I get. I mean, you guys can tell me what you think in the chat, but I think he's smarter than Kim Jung-gi. I feel like he's got the drawing chops. He's got the design. He's got the thinking. Like, to me, he's a much better artist than Kim Jung-gi. I know it might feel unfair to compare them, but because we did bring up that crit clash earlier, I think it's hard not to make that comparison for me.
Clara, you're stealing the show. Everybody's saying
I'm
you're
just giving in some commentary so they have time to evaluate and let all those ideas sink in. That's all.
I like this one here. 7 Angelic Enigma 7 says Crum loses, Prof wins.
Because you know something, guys? Here's another thing. When I was a kid, Mad Magazine was really, really popular. Like, I actually saw it at the library the other day. Well, not the other day, a couple months ago. And I was like, oh yeah, that magazine's not that popular anymore, because it probably doesn't fit very well in the year 2020. But you know what? When I was a kid, I devoured the Mad magazines. I loved them. And yes, they were horrible and disgusting and
but they're so good.
They're fabulous. And so I can't discredit that. Like, I know it's 2020. I know misogyny is terrible. I'm a woman. I'm against all those things. But it's hard for me to not just get so absorbed in this horrible world.
You were socialized to love that horrible world.
I'm acknowledging that I did love that horrible world as a
like,
young kid.
I feel like our Crum is like a movie from the 2000s, comedy movie from the 2000s, where it is really dated. It ages very poorly, but you still love it because it speaks to some horrible, rotten thing within humanity. I'm thinking of the movie like Idiocracy, for instance.
Well, that's what I'm saying is I don't think that art history can always promote positive things all the time. I think at a certain point you have to acknowledge some of what's really terrible. And I mean, look at this image here. This is horrific, right? I mean, look at the thing that's flying off in the upper right-hand corner. I mean, this is as horrible as it gets
We're not
in
allowed
terms
to say
of
what it is on YouTube.
Well,
yes, we're not going to say.
That image is a little more, at least everyone is willing to be there. And this one brought up by W315 Bird puts it perfectly. I think Crum is smart and skilled, but held back by his emotional junk, so Lauryn. And yeah, I think for me, Crum is an example of, like, you know, the printed page is permanent. Your work is permanent, and your artistic history is permanent, and you have to kind of be intentional about the kind of work you produce and how you make it.
Yeah.
Well, this is an interesting comment from James. They're saying, as horrible as it is, we still feel nostalgic. And that's another thing, is you could argue against me and say, well, Clara, you read those comics when you were 10. Of course, they make you feel a little warm and fuzzy, even though they were horrible and disgusting. And so, yeah, I mean, you have to think about the context, like when this work came out. If this work came out today, I don't think it would go anywhere, or he would be absolutely destroyed on Twitter in 3 seconds. I mean, it would not last a minute. if it came into today's atmosphere. So let me know, you guys. We still have not seen who won the crit clash. We saw a lot of people who sort of chickened out and said that they were conflicted, but we need to have a winner here so somebody can hold it against somebody else.
Okay, this is an argument to me, okay? I didn't mention this yet, but I said that I would, and that, so he does these very provocative subject matters and jokes, but artists, gay and feminist artists in, I'm going to say, I guess it's the decade afterwards, also did similar kinds of work, but in a way that was much more sensitive to the different parties involved and still was hilarious. So I would recommend looking up the punk zine feminist era and then looking at this work and telling me what you think.
Well, let's see. Seven Angelic seems to think that I won. So, that's pretty good. I won the fight I wasn't a part of. I like that. And it seems like a lot of people are conflicted. Yep, let me see. Do we have some more comments coming in? Johnny says Lauryn made her point.
Thanks,
and
Johnny.
McNeil is saying, you guys are my favorite YouTube teachers. I don't always agree, but I've learned a lot. Alex has the edge for me.
Alex just started con, though. You just wormed your way into con.
Yeah, no, I won the pro side, even being con. That's how good of an argument I made.
Wow, so we've never had a crit clash where this many people were conflicted, because Seven Angelic says Lauryn because Crum is just too much, and 10,000 Crows says, I can't believe our video got interrupted when Clara was drawing butts, but YouTube doesn't mind this.
So YouTube lost. We can just all agree on that. YouTube lost by being hypocritical.
I suppose so.
They like butts, but not Clara's.
We don't have a ton of votes because so many of you are conflicted, but I suppose I would declare Lauryn to be the winner of this crit clash.
Oh.
you got eaten.
Aaron Moore nailed that. I agree with Lauryn. I usually do. Well.
You might try arguing the side that you're supposed to argue. That might help you in the future.
Let me say that for a very revealing behind the curtain what Alex really thinks, my goal was that everyone is conflicted, because I think that's the proper response to Crum. I think that you cannot say like, oh, I love his work. I don't think you can say that anymore. I think you have to acknowledge the problems with it.
Well, aren't you a horrible person if you say you love it 100%? Like, there's got to be a part of you that hates it too, right?
I think you're, if anything, over dramatic if you say you love it 100%.
I don't know. Maybe some people do. I have no idea.
I mean, someone loves it 100% because it was at David Zwirner. So only people that are really, someone had to really love him to put him there.
Or want to make a lot of money. That's another option too.
That's true. It makes a lot of money.
Art Prof has a podcast. It is available on Spotify and also on iTunes. We would love it for you guys to leave us a rating and a review. And please join us on the Discord after the stream. In about 5 minutes, we will be in the Crit Clash Reveals channel. More to chat about. My goodness, I could talk about him forever. There's just so much to chew on. Please subscribe to our channel and join the Art Prof family. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters who make everything here possible, keep us up and running. Thank you to everybody for all of your comments, for contributing. You guys really make the discussion so rich and so interesting to engage with. So thank you so much for participating. We will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.